Hello, everyone. Happy Tuesday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings. Well, as I shared with you recently, I'm not going to change my clothes for every video. My wife will appreciate that, by the way. So anyway, this is Tuesday, wearing the same shirt that I used to produce yesterday's video. And I will be wearing this to produce Wednesday and Thursday's video, even though I'm actually filming on Tuesday. Got that? Confusing? Maybe. Whatever. Just to let you know. So I'll have a tag at the first of the videos so that you'll know what day, and of course I'll give the greeting for the day of the filming. Not a big deal, but I just wanted to share that with you. All right. We are continuing our study of the Olivet Discourse, and we are focused now on Matthew 25:31 and following. The Son of Man coming in his glory to sit on the throne of his glory, then all the nations shall be gathered before him. We are told very clearly this could not have happened yet, because all nations of the earth were not gathered together. It's interesting, on Facebook yesterday, Monday actually, I had an individual, two individuals actually, commenting on 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. Now, this touches on a little bit what I shared with you yesterday. And this one individual said, even a casual reading of 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 lets anyone know it's not been fulfilled. And my response to that was, the problem with your view is you are doing this, quote, casual reading through the lens not of ancient Hebraic readers or writers. You are reading the text through the eyes of a Western, Occidental, Greek world view. You are completely, by your reference to just a casual reading, you are completely ignoring the Hebraic context and content of the language. So please go back and watch yesterday's video. I didn't deal with it extensively, but this is absolutely critical. We have to familiarize ourselves with the thought, the expressions, the literature, the genre of the biblical languages, and by the way, virtually all scholars are agreed on this. The Hebraic language is metaphoric, it's poetic, it's picturesque, conjuring up mental images, not focused on rigid literalism, and that doesn't mean they never speak of things literally, but they spoke of, quote, world-changing events like the fall of a city, a kingdom, a nation, etc., by describing it with decreation language. The destruction of the sun, the moon, the stars, etc., when they did not have the destruction of the literal creation in mind. Okay, now yesterday I shared with you how a lot of people try to use Joel chapter 3. Now, Joel chapter 3, why am I alluding to it? It is because Joel chapter 3, 1 and 2 says, in those days and at that time, I will gather all nations to judgment. Okay, so Matthew chapter 25, the gathering all nations to judgment. Joel 3, the gathering of all nations to judgment. Well, Joel tells us that gathering of the nations would be in those days and at that time. What are those days? The last days. What are the last days? Well, we know from Deuteronomy 32, verses 19 and following, chapter 32, 31 and following, that term, the last days, or the latter times, is a reference not to the end of time, but to the end of Old Covenant Israel's time. the last generation of Israel. Twice there in the Song of Moses, we are told that the Song of Moses, using the term the last end, the latter end, is a reference to Israel's last end. Furthermore, the specific term, the last days, eschaton hemeron, I believe is the correct, is used in Isaiah chapter 2 to speak of the time of the establishment of the kingdom. It is used similarly in Joel chapter 2, verse 28, which Peter applied to his generation. So when we put all of these pieces together, we know that the last days is a reference not to the last days of time, not to the last days of the Christian age, but to the last days of Israel. But again, we are told that cannot be, because Joel speaks of the judgment of the nations, of the gathering of the nations. And again, I have had people tell me just very, very recently, Preston, the Gentiles were not judged in the first century. You are simply wrong. Well, first of all, we have to understand the universalistic nature of the AD 70 judgment. In Matthew chapter 23, 29 and following, Jesus castigated the Jews, and he said, "Which of the prophets have you not slain? You are the sons of those who killed the prophets. And you bear witness that you are the sons of those who killed the prophets, because you say, well, if we had been alive in the days of our fathers, we would not have slain the prophets. Thereby you bear witness to yourselves that you are the sons of the prophets. Fill up then the measure of your father's guilt. Behold, I send to you prophets, wise men, and scribes. Some of them you shall crucify. Some of them you shall scourge. You shall chase them from city to city, that upon you may come all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from righteous Abel unto Zacharias, son of Barachias, whom you slew between the temple and the altar." Now, just recently on YouTube, one individual popped up and said, well, if you are going to say that there were resurrected bodies running around everywhere to be judged in the first century, then I'm going to absolutely deny that. Well, in the first place, I never said anything about resurrected physical bodies running around and standing in judgment. That's a total misrepresentation of what I have said. This individual repeatedly denied that the nations were judged, that Gentiles were judged in AD 70. I finally asked, are you denying the words of the Lord in Matthew 23? Folks, let me ask you a question. I have people tell me all the time, AD 70 was a strictly local judgment. AD 70 didn't amount to anything. AD 70 was nothing, as one YouTube or Facebook denier recently expressed it. Well, let me ask you a question. Were there any Jews around in the days of Abel? Nope, not a one. And yet the judgment of AD 70 was the judgment of those who shed the blood of Abel. And of course, the vindication of Abel himself. Abel was not a Jew. He wasn't resurrected in a physical body running around to be judged in AD 70, but Jesus put his vindication, the vindication of his shed blood, and the judgment of his killer, his brother, who was not a Jew. Jesus put that judgment in AD 70. How local of a judgment was that, ladies and gentlemen? The idea, and of course, I understand I really do. I understand why some people want to depreciate and to disparage the significance and the importance of the judgment of AD 70. A real quick anecdote, and I'll close out this morning's video, and we'll pick this up tomorrow about the judgment of the nations in AD 70. In 2008, I believe it was, I had a formal public debate with a minister from the Churches of Christ named John Welch. And he got up in one of his presentations and rather arrogantly, rather stridently said, that I make way too much of the judgment in AD 70. And he said, look, Paul wrote to Corinth, he wrote to Ephesus, he wrote to Macedonia, and he said, why in the world would the people in Athens, Ephesus, Corinth, why in the world would they even care about the judgment of Jerusalem? It was hundreds and hundreds of miles away. They didn't care anything about the judgment of Jerusalem. And listen, in that debate, 4-night debate, I had double pneumonia. One of the worst cases, and I've had double pneumonia 13 times, but one of the worst cases I've ever had, every single night on my way back to the hotel room, I had to stop and throw up. I mean, I was just sick out of my mind. And so it wasn't the greatest debate job I've ever done, but when he got up and disparaged the judgment of AD 70 by saying, what would the people in Corinth or Athens or Macedonia and Asia, why would they care about the fall of Jerusalem? I got up and I said, well, Brother Welch asked the question and tries to make the point, since Jerusalem was 800 or 1,000 miles away from some of these places that the epistles are written to, they would not have cared. It would have had no impact on them. It would have meant nothing to them. So I said, well, let me ask a question to Brother Welch. Paul went to Athens and he talked about the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. But Athens was hundreds of miles away. Why in the world would the men in Athens or Corinth or Ephesus or wherever that was hundreds of miles away, and by the way, why would we in America, 6,000 miles removed from Golgotha, why should we care about the death of just another rabble-rousing Jew? And I made the point, ladies and gentlemen, the size of an event does not determine its importance. Distance from that event does not determine whether or not we should be concerned with it. And I want to tell you, as I looked out over that audience, I saw people literally going, wow, 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 turning to one another and going, whew. I mean, how can anybody be so illogical as to try to make that argument? Now, that comes into play when we ask the question, in the judgment of Jerusalem, could the nations have been judged? Was Jerusalem and its judgment strictly a localized event with no universal importance, with no importance that would allow us to see that Matthew 25, 31 and following is in fact a description of the coming of the Son of Man to sit on the throne of his glory in the judgment of AD 70. When we understand the Hebraic, pattern of thought, and when we look at a host of scriptures concerning judgment, we can confidently say the judgment of the nations took place in AD 70. Listen, don't forget, the rest of the month of January 2022, U.S. orders only. You go to my website, you order $25 or more of material, doesn't matter what it is, and guess what? 15% discount plus free shipping. Take advantage of that. And in the meantime, I'll see you on the flip side.